Jack Preston, a rugged cowboy with a reputation for being tough and independent, rode through the vast, dry plains of the American West. He had always preferred the open land to the crowded towns and busy cities, where the noise and people made him uneasy. His horse, a sturdy mare named Daisy, moved steadily beneath him as they trekked through the rugged terrain. Jack had no particular destination in mind. The world was his to explore, and he liked it that way. The silence of the wilderness was his only companion, and he'd grown used to the solitude. That day, the sky was clear, and the sun was starting to dip low, casting long shadows over the land. Jack had been on the trail for hours, with nothing but the wind and the occasional bird to break the stillness. The landscape around him was dry and barren, with only small bushes and cacti scattered across the land. It was the kind of place that made a man feel small and insignificant. But Jack found a strange comfort in it. As he continued along the trail, Jack's sharp eyes noticed something unusual. In the distance, a cloud of dust was rising into the air. It was too thick to be caused by a passing animal or wind, and Jack instinctively felt that something wasn't right. He urged Daisy into a faster trot, his mind racing with possibilities. Could it be a group of bandits? Or perhaps a wandering herd of cattle? He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and they told him to investigate. The closer Jack got, the clearer the scene became. A group of settlers was surrounding a woman, and they were clearly threatening her. From the way they moved, Jack could tell they weren't interested in negotiation. They were about to do something terrible. The woman, though outnumbered, stood her ground, her back straight, her eyes defiant. Jack felt his blood begin to boil. It wasn't uncommon for outsiders to mistreat the Apache, but he never imagined he would witness it firsthand. Without thinking, Jack spurred Daisy forward, drawing his rifle from its holster. His voice rang out across the desert, commanding the settlers to stop. The settlers looked up in surprise, clearly startled by his sudden appearance. Jack's reputation had spread far and wide, and they recognized him as a cowboy who wasn't afraid to fight for what was right. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, took a step forward and sneered. "What do you want, cowboy?" the man growled, his hand resting on the handle of a revolver at his hip. Jack didn't flinch. "I want you to leave her alone," he said firmly. His voice was calm, but there was a steely edge to it. "You've made a mistake, and I'm here to correct it." The woman, who had been standing tall with pride despite the situation, turned her head slightly. Jack could see the fear in her eyes, but there was also a quiet strength in the way she held herself. She didn't speak, but her gaze met his, and for a brief moment, it felt as though time stopped. Jack didn't know why, but there was something about her that drew him in, something that made him want to protect her. Even though they were strangers, the burly man laughed, though it sounded forced. "You're outnumbered, cowboy. You think you can take all of us?" Jack didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The sound was deafening, and the settlers froze, their eyes widening in surprise. The woman flinched at the loud sound but didn't look away from Jack. He took a few cautious steps forward, his rifle still aimed at the men, and the tension in the air grew thick. "I don't want trouble," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "But if you don't leave her alone, you'll find more trouble than you're ready for." The settlers exchanged uncertain glances. They were clearly outmatched, but they weren't ready to back down. The burly man gritted his teeth and gestured to his companions. "We don't need to take this from a damn cowboy," he snarled. For a moment, it seemed like things were about to escalate. Jack's hand tightened around the rifle, his fingers itching to pull the trigger if it came to that. But before he could make another move, the woman spoke for the first time. Her voice quiet but filled with authority. "Leave now," she said, her words carrying more weight than any threat Jack had made. "Go back to your homes and forget you ever saw me. If you do not, my people will deal with you." The settlers hesitated. There was something about the woman's calm presence that unnerved them. Finally, the burly man cursed under his breath and motioned for the others to retreat. With one last look at Jack, they turned and made their way back down the trail, their retreating figures disappearing into the dusty horizon. As the settlers left, Jack lowered his rifle, though he kept a watchful eye on the area. The woman remained where she was, standing tall and composed, her expression unreadable. Jack dismounted from Daisy and walked toward her slowly, careful not to invade her space. He didn't know what to say. He'd never been good with words, especially not with someone so proud and fierce as her. She didn't seem to mind the silence. For a moment, they simply stood there, the tension from the confrontation still hanging in the air. Then, without warning, the woman dropped her gaze to the ground and spoke again. This time, with more emotion in her voice. "Thank you," she said, her words soft but sincere. "You didn't have to do that." Jack nodded, though he felt an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. It was the right thing to do. The woman met his gaze again, and for a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Jack felt a strange pull, an unspoken connection, but he didn't understand it. She was an Apache woman, and he was just a cowboy. There was no place for someone like him in her world, and he knew it. But there was something in her eyes, something that made him want to stay and learn more. "I'm Ayana," she said after a pause, her voice steady once more. "And you are?" "Jack," he replied, his voice rougher than usual. "Jack Preston." Ayana's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't say anything more. Jack could tell that, while she was grateful for his help, she wasn't about to let her guard down easily. She had learned to trust very few people in her life, and strangers, especially cowboys, weren't high on her list. "I need to get back to my people," she said quietly, looking toward the horizon. "But I thank you for your help." Jack nodded, understanding that she was likely going to keep her distance. Still, something inside him urged him to offer to help her further, to make sure she was safe. "Do you need me to escort you?" he asked, his voice careful. "I can take you back to your camp." Ayana looked at him for a long time before shaking her head. "No, I can manage," she said firmly. "But thank you." Jack hesitated, watching as she turned to walk away. There was no mistaking the grace in her step, the strength in the way she moved. She was different from any woman he had ever met, and there was a part of him that wanted to follow her, to learn more about the world she came from. But he didn't. He knew better than to push. Ayana wasn't the kind of woman who needed saving, even if he felt a deep desire to protect her. With a final glance, Ayana disappeared into the desert, her figure blending with the endless stretch of land. Jack stood there for a moment longer, his heart beating faster than it should have, before mounting his horse. As he rode away, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. Jack Preston could not shake the image of Ayana from his mind. Every night, as he lay under the stars, her face seemed to appear in his thoughts. He had seen many things in his life, had ridden through storms, fought off dangers, and faced the hardships of the wilderness, but nothing had left him quite as unsettled as the encounter with Ayana. There was a quiet strength about her, a fierceness that resonated deep within him. He was used to people in the frontier, but Ayana was different. She wasn't like the women Jack had met in towns or camps. She wasn't frightened by him. In fact, it was clear she didn't need anyone's protection, but she had accepted his help when it mattered. That fact alone made Jack wonder if there was more to her than just the typical Apache warrior's daughter. The following days were spent in solitude, as Jack continued his travels across the wide-open country. He often found himself retracing the path where he had encountered Ayana, looking for signs of her passing, as though his heart hoped to find her once again. Each time he convinced himself to move on, another thought about her would emerge, and Jack would find himself wondering what had become of her. It wasn't long before Jack's path crossed the same stretch of desert once more. This time, however, he didn't expect to find Ayana. He didn't even think he would see any sign of her. He had never expected their brief meeting to mean much beyond a passing encounter. But fate had other plans. As Jack rode through the familiar land, he spotted a cloud of dust once more in the distance. Just as he had that fateful day. His heart skipped a beat, and instinctively, He spurred Daisy into a faster pace. This time, however, he wasn't racing toward a conflict. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but the possibility that Ayanna might be somewhere near drew him forward. As he neared the source of the dust, his eyes caught sight of something he hadn't expected at all. Ayanna, riding a horse alongside a small group of Apache warriors. They were moving slowly, but with purpose. Jack could tell they weren't lost. They were on a mission of some kind. The group appeared to be heading toward a nearby creek, likely in search of water. Ayanna rode confidently, her eyes scanning the horizon as if every movement in the distance was a potential threat. Even from a distance, Jack could see the beauty in her strong yet graceful presence. Jack slowed Daisy to a walk as he approached, unsure of how to make himself known. He wasn't sure how Ayanna would react to seeing him again, especially if she was with her people. The last time they had met, she hadn't seemed overly interested in his company, and Jack wasn't the type to push himself on others. But there was something inside him, a curiosity, a pull that made him want to know more about the woman who had so captured his thoughts. He kept his distance, watching as Ayanna and her group arrived at the creek. They dismounted, and Ayanna immediately knelt by the water, cupping her hands to drink. She didn't seem to notice Jack at first, but her companions had. One of the warriors spotted him and narrowed his eyes, his hand resting on the handle of a knife at his side. The man said something to Ayanna in their language, and she turned to look in Jack's direction. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Jack felt his pulse quicken. Ayanna's expression was unreadable, but Jack could tell she recognized him. Her gaze softened slightly, but there was still a guarded quality to it. She stood slowly, wiping her hands on her pants, and motioned for the other warriors to continue their task at the creek. Ayanna walked toward Jack with purpose. But there was no hostility in her movements, only curiosity. As she drew near, Jack felt a surge of nervous energy. He wasn't sure why it was happening, but every instinct in him wanted to run. Yet he stayed firmly in place. She was now so close, standing just a few feet in front of him. "I didn't expect to see you again," she said, her voice calm but tinged with something that Jack couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, but there was a coolness to her words that told him she was unsure of how to approach him, just as much as he was unsure about her. "I didn't either," Jack replied, his voice a little rougher than he intended. He shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, trying to appear less out of place in the situation. For a moment, there was silence. Ayanna didn't seem in a hurry to speak, and Jack wasn't sure what to say next. Instead, they simply stood there, sizing each other up in a way that was almost uncomfortable. Jack knew that she was an Apache, a member of a proud and warrior-like people. He knew that he was just a cowboy, an outsider, and that any relationship between them would be complicated at best. But for some reason, none of that seemed to matter as much as it had before. There was something about her, about them, that made him feel like maybe they could find some kind of understanding. "You're not here to cause trouble?" Ayanna asked after a long pause. Her eyes searched his face, as if looking for any sign of deception. Jack shook his head slowly. "No. I came across your group by accident. I didn't know where you were headed." Ayanna studied him for a moment, and Jack wondered if she truly believed him. Her face remained calm, but there was an intensity in her eyes that Jack couldn't ignore. Finally, she nodded and motioned for him to follow her toward the group. "If you're truly not here to cause trouble, then you're welcome to stay for a while," she said, her voice steady. Jack was surprised by her offer, but before he could say anything, one of the Apache warriors approached them. The man was tall, with a stern expression on his face. His eyes flickered briefly to Jack, before returning to Ayanna. "Ayanna, we should keep moving," the man said in their language, his tone insistent. "The sun is setting." Ayanna glanced at the warrior, then back at Jack. She hesitated, clearly torn. Finally, she spoke again, this time with a touch of warmth in her voice. "Perhaps we will meet again," she said softly, almost as if she was speaking more to herself than to him. "But for now, I must go." Before Jack could reply, Ayana turned and walked back to her group. Jack watched her as she disappeared into the distance, once again feeling that strange pull. This time, though, it was stronger. He had thought he was just passing through. But now, there was something deeper stirring within him. A longing to know more about her. To understand her world. As he turned Daisy around and began to ride in the opposite direction, Jack couldn't help but wonder if this was just the beginning of something far more complicated than he had ever imagined. What had started as a simple act of kindness had evolved into something far deeper. And though Jack was no stranger to danger, he felt that what lay ahead, his growing feelings for Ayana, might be the most dangerous thing of all. The days after Jack's brief encounter with Ayana were filled with uncertainty. As he continued his journey through the desert, his mind often wandered back to her, her strong eyes, the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence in her every movement. He couldn't help but feel a connection to her, even if it was just in passing. But Jack knew he could not afford to become distracted. The land was vast and unforgiving, and the road he traveled was long and uncertain. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths would cross again. And cross they did. It had been 2 weeks since he last saw Ayana, and Jack had moved on to a small settlement near the foothills. He had heard nothing more about the Apache or the tension between the tribes and the settlers, though it was clear that conflict simmered just beneath the surface. One morning, as Jack saddled up Daisy for another day on the road, he was stopped by a young man from the town. "You're Jack Preston, right?" the man asked, his voice full of uncertainty. "That's right," Jack replied, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to place the young man's face. I was told to find you." The man continued, shifting his weight nervously. "There's someone who needs your help. A woman, I think. She's from the Apache." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "Ayana?" he asked without thinking. Though he knew it was unlikely, the man shook his head. "I don't know her name, but she's asking for you. She's with a group of Apache. They're camped outside of town." The news hit Jack like a punch to the gut. Ayana? Here? He didn't know why, but he felt an immediate need to see her again. To make sure she was safe. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't just about saving someone, it was about something deeper, something that made his heart race just thinking about it. "I'll go to them," Jack said after a moment, his voice firm. The young man nodded and watched as Jack mounted Daisy. Jack's thoughts raced as he rode toward the spot where the Apache group had camped. What had brought Ayana here? And why had she asked for him? He didn't know, but the feeling that something was amiss kept gnawing at him. As Jack approached the camp, he saw the familiar figures of Apache warriors standing guard. They glanced at him with cautious eyes, and for a moment, he felt like an outsider once again. He was just a cowboy, a stranger in their land. Yet, his instincts told him that whatever was happening here, he needed to be a part of it. He rode slowly into the camp, his heart thumping in his chest. The moment Ayana saw him, her expression shifted. There was no sign of surprise, no sign of anger. She simply met his gaze with a quiet intensity, as though she had been expecting him. "Jack," she said softly, stepping forward from the group. Her voice held an emotion he couldn't quite place. "I'm glad you came." Jack dismounted, his eyes scanning the camp for any signs of trouble. "What's going on, Ayana? Why did you send for me?" Ayana's eyes darkened, and she glanced behind her toward the group of Apache warriors. "It's not safe here," she said quietly. "We're being hunted." Jack felt his heart tighten. "Hunted? By who?" "By settlers who want to drive us out. They're getting closer every day," she explained, her voice low but steady. "We've had to move quickly. My people are tired, and the land is becoming harder to defend. We're being pushed to the edge. And I don't know how much longer we can hold out." Jack's mind raced. He had known that tensions between settlers and the Apache were high, but he had never imagined things had escalated to this point. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice firm with resolve. Ayana's gaze softened as she took a step closer. "You've already done so much. But now, we need to make a choice. We can't stay here much longer. My father, Chief Ahuli, wants to move further into the mountains. It's a dangerous journey, but it may be our only option. Jack nodded. He knew the mountains well. They were wild and untamed, full of hidden dangers, but they were also a place where the Apache had always found refuge. If anyone could survive there, it would be Ayanna and her people. "I'll help you," Jack said, his words stronger than he felt. "I'll help you get to the mountains. I'll help you get to the mountains." Ayanna didn't speak for a moment. Instead, she studied him with those piercing eyes of hers. "I don't want to put you in danger, Jack," she said quietly. "This is my fight, not yours. You don't owe us anything." Jack felt a sharp pain in his chest at her words. He wasn't helping her because he owed her. He was helping her because he couldn't stand the thought of her being in danger, of her people being pushed away like this. There was more to it than just a sense of duty. It was something deeper, something that made him feel like his heart had already been claimed by the Apache woman. "I'm not leaving you," Jack said firmly, his voice full of determination. "I'm not leaving anyone here to suffer alone." Ayanna's eyes softened, and for the first time, Jack saw a flicker of something in her expression, something that resembled trust. "You're a brave man, Jack Preston," she said quietly. "But be careful. These people, they are desperate. They won't hesitate to hurt you." Jack's gaze hardened. "Let them try," he muttered under his breath. Though he knew the danger would be real. He couldn't afford to be reckless, but he also couldn't walk away. He wouldn't. Over the next few days, Jack helped the Apache prepare for the journey into the mountains. He worked alongside them, building fires, gathering supplies, and making sure they had what they needed. Despite the heavy air of tension that hung over the camp, there was also a sense of solidarity, a shared understanding that they were all in this together. Jack found himself feeling closer to the Apache people than ever before, as they accepted him into their fold with quiet respect. But the threat of the settlers loomed larger each day. Jack could see the worry in Ayanna's eyes as they prepared to leave. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about preserving her way of life, her people's way of life. She had spent so much of her life fighting for them, and now it seemed like it was all slipping away. On the morning they were set to leave, Jack and Ayanna stood side by side at the edge of the camp, looking out over the vast landscape. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the desert. Ayanna's face was unreadable, but there was a quiet strength in the way she stood. Jack couldn't help but feel proud to be standing beside her, to be part of something that meant so much to her. "I won't let anything happen to you," Jack said quietly, his words sincere. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He would fight for Ayanna and her people until his last breath. Ayanna didn't respond at first. She simply nodded, her eyes never leaving the horizon. Jack could see the weight she carried, the burden of her people's fate resting on her shoulders. But he also saw something else in her eyes, a spark of hope. They both knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but there was a chance they could make it. They had each other. And that, Jack thought, might be enough. As they began to move out, Jack rode alongside Ayanna, ready for whatever lay ahead. And though the road was uncertain, one thing was clear. The bond between them had only grown stronger. And nothing, not even the dangers of the frontier, could tear them apart. The days that followed were a blur of movement. Jack and the Apache group traveled at a steady pace, their journey taking them deeper into the mountains, away from the settlement and the ever-looming threat of the settlers. The air was crisp and cool in the higher elevations, a stark contrast to the dry heat of the plains. Yet, even in this beautiful wilderness, there was no peace. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound of footsteps, made the Apache warriors on edge. They knew that the settlers were still out there, hunting them, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Jack had seen enough of the world to understand the dangers of the wilderness, but he had never felt this kind of tension. The Apache were skilled fighters, and Jack had learned quickly that they trusted him, but only so far. The bond they had formed was built on respect, but Jack was still an outsider. He could never fully understand their way of life, nor could he truly see the struggles they faced. He was there to help, but Ayanna and her people carried a heavy burden that Jack couldn't carry for them. Ayanna, though strong, had an air of sadness around her that Jack couldn't ignore. He noticed the way she would often pause and look back toward the land they were leaving behind. A quiet longing in her eyes. He understood why this was her home, the land of her ancestors, and now it was slipping through her fingers. It wasn't just the land she was losing. It was her people's way of life, their traditions, and their future. Every time Jack tried to speak to her about it, she would shut him out, not wanting to burden him with the weight of her worries. But Jack could see the toll it was taking on her. She wasn't just a warrior. She was the daughter of the chief, and the weight of her father's expectations rested heavily on her shoulders. She had spent her whole life preparing to lead her people. But now, she wasn't sure if there would even be a people left to lead. The journey grew harder with each passing day. The higher they climbed into the mountains, the more difficult the terrain became. The rocky paths made it hard for the horses to navigate, and the group was forced to move slowly, making camp at night and resting during the hottest part of the day. Jack did everything he could to help, but there were times when even he was exhausted, his body aching from the constant physical strain. One evening, as they set up camp, Ayanna came to Jack with a quiet request. She asked him to walk with her for a while. It wasn't unusual for her to ask him to help with something, but this time, her tone was different. There was something in her voice, an underlying vulnerability that made Jack put down the wood he was gathering and follow her without question. They walked in silence for a while. The cool mountain air surrounding them. The sound of the distant wind in the trees, the only noise between them. Ayanna led him to a small clearing at the edge of a cliff, where they could see the valley below. The view was breathtaking, mountains stretching out in every direction, a patchwork of forest and river below. It was the kind of view that made you feel small, like you were just a tiny piece of a much larger world. For a long time, Ayanna didn't speak. She simply stared out at the landscape, lost in thought. Jack knew she was struggling, but he didn't know how to reach her. The distance between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but he knew he couldn't promise that. The future was uncertain, and the world was changing in ways neither of them could control. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ayanna spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost as if she was speaking more to herself than to Jack. "I used to dream about this place," she said softly, her eyes not leaving the view in front of her. "When I was a child, I would sit by the fire and listen to the stories of my people. My father would tell me about the beauty of these mountains, about how the land would always be here for us, no matter what happened. He said the mountains would protect us." Jack watched her carefully, his heart heavy with the sadness in her words. "You don't think that's true anymore?" he asked gently, not wanting to push but needing to understand. Ayanna finally turned to face him. There was a deep sorrow in her eyes, one that made Jack ache for her. "I don't know," she said. "I've spent my whole life believing in my people's strength, in our traditions, in the power of the land. But now I wonder if it's all slipping away." Jack took a step closer, wanting to offer some comfort, but not knowing how. "Ayanna, you're strong. You and your people have survived so much already. You'll survive this too." She shook her head, a small, sad smile playing at the corner of her lips. "I wish it were that simple. We can't keep running forever, and even if we do survive this, what kind of life will we have left?" Jack could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the doubt that had settled deep within her heart. She wasn't just worried about the survival of her people. She was worried about losing everything that had defined her. Jack understood that fear more than she could know. He had spent his life moving from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots. But for Ayanna, her entire identity was tied to her people, their way of life, and their connection to the land. "I don't have the answers," Jack said quietly. "But I do know one thing. I won't let you face this alone. Whatever happens, I'm here. I'll fight for you. I'll fight for your people." Ayanna's expression softened, and for a moment, it felt like the distance between them had closed just a little. She took a deep breath, then looked out over the valley once more. "I don't want to lose you, Jack," she said softly. The words hit Jack like a wave, and his heart skipped a beat. He had known, deep down, that his feelings for Ayanna had grown stronger over time, but hearing her speak those words out loud made everything feel real. Ayanna had never been the type to express vulnerability, especially not to someone like him, and yet, there she was, opening up in a way he never thought she would. "You won't lose me," Jack replied, his voice steady, though his emotions ran deep. "I promise." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of everything they had been through hanging in the air between them. There was still so much uncertainty ahead, and the danger wasn't over. But in that moment, standing together at the edge of the mountain, Jack felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The next morning, they continued their journey, moving deeper into the mountains, the dangers still lingering in the distance. But now, there was something different. Ayanna and Jack had formed a bond that couldn't be broken, no matter the obstacles they would face. As they rode through the rugged terrain, Jack felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever before. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for the future of Ayanna and her people. Though their path was uncertain, Jack knew one thing for sure. His heart was forever tied to Ayanna, and no matter what happened, he would stand by her side until the very end.